Bridget, Kyong Fatchwai, thank you for doing this again. Obviously, this is quite interesting for us to talk now because the whole ASEAN Chair issue has become quite interesting. And you've been a vocal commentator on this with your columns. And I thought I'd reach out to you, and you graciously agreed to come on and chat about it. You wrote in your op-eds that obviously Anwar Ibrahim, our Prime Minister, takes on the mantle this year as ASEAN Chair. But you also have your reservations about his position there. What did you mean by that in your op-ed?
Thanks very much for the clarification. Not only do I write a column, I actually have a regional podcast called Straight Talk Southeast Asia, which actually covers the issues in the region. This week's episode, for example, looks at the issues of tariffs. But first of all, I think it's very important to recognize that Anwar Ibrahim did not take on the chair. Malaysia took on the chair, and it does every 10 years. And so I think, there's been a column today in Malaysia Kini that talks about the importance of disaggregating between the prime minister and the country, and also to recognize it's a rotating chair. And so, of course, one plays the role that a chair can play no matter what is still one that is very limited because you're dealing with 10 different countries. So what did I mean when I raised these discussion points? I think that there were three. Number one is that there are risks when you brand the chairmanship around an individual. We can see this in the history of ASEAN, right? And when it's seen as an individual, then it also it provokes reaction from regional players, but it also creates higher expectations, which might make it more challenging for there to be fulfillment, right? And I think the second issue that I tried to say is that, the choices you make when you try to have that, open yourself up to greater criticism. And so what we saw in December of this year is considerable criticism over the Thaksin choice as an advisor, and this criticism came from Thailand, came from Cambodia, came from other places, including written in the Jakarta Post. And I use that as an illustration. Hey, if you start to have your own things that go outside of the norms, this opens yourself up to criticism. And the third point I would say is that, that the most important thing about ASEAN right now, as it faces a really important period of global insecurity and global uncertainty, is that, the focus point needs to be on ASEAN itself. And so the majority of my article was not about these issues about the Prime Minister of Malaysia, but in fact actually aimed to be constructive, to offer three different suggestions how to have a successful chairmanship that would actually reach the issues that that ASEAN needs to address. And those are the things that I try to emphasize, which, if interestingly, have been not in the rebuttal. And those were to focus on the economy and issues of trade. Number two, to focus on the issues of transnational crime. And three, to really have a much more genuinely inclusive solution issues to the Myanmar crisis. Because if you continue with the five points consensus in terms of constraining, that actually limits the opportunity to have this year to be an opportunity to shift and change the discussion on the crisis, because the circumstances in Myanmar excuse me, I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
I muted myself to let you talk. And Bridget, the kind of stuff that faces ASEAN today are ginormous, right? You've got the Trump tariffs, which are massive. Myanmar, which is, of course, huge repercussions for human rights, and transnational crime, which I'm not even sure where to begin in terms of repercussions beyond, obviously, tourism, right? And then you've got the things that are going on in the South China Sea. Which of those issues are the most massive for ASEAN to consider, or which are in what order of importance should they be taken on?
Actually, one of the points I was raising is that given that there's so much to do, it is important to have clear priorities and to have a plan. And so my column was based on discussions of people at the Langkawi meeting in January, and also a careful reading of the communique that came out of that meeting. And what was a challenge that I highlighted is that there wasn't a clear set of priorities. When you have a very, very long list, it doesn't necessarily say, here are the things we're going to try to focus on. And so generally in ASEAN chairmanships, there's been a kind of limited constraint. What we've seen so far is that the effort is to try to increase and to provide, to make it broader in terms of the whole scope of things. And inevitably, we all know in life, when you try to do too much, you don't necessarily do it as successfully. And so my, again, a constructive element was to try to sort of say, what are these things that are the most important? The economy of the region. And this is now where we see the region facing much more internal competition from itself, much more challenges from U.S.-China tensions. Clearly, with the economic coercion of the Trump administration, this is going to bring in different things. So the centrality of ASEAN around something that can bring the region together was part of what I was trying to emphasize, but was one of the issues. The second issue that I think I highlighted is the urgency of transnational crime. And I do think that it's a big problem. We all know that. But the fact of the matter is that it needs a regional response. And so far, the lack of a regional response has been, and the very minimal regional response has prevented serious traction. And I wanted to keep in point that in 2015, Malaysia was the first country as chair in her previous chair leadership, which I didn't mention in the article because we're limited in words, but she actually set out a framework on issues of transnational crime. So there is a history of Malaysia working in this area that could have built traction. You mentioned, and the third issue, of course, as I said, the Myanmar crisis. Now, the fact of the matter is the Myanmar crisis is going to be multiple year issues, but there needs to be a systematic changing of the approach in order to find a viable solution to a situation where you have countries of a situation of multiple sovereignty within the context of Myanmar. And again, my recommendation was very minor, which is to acknowledge that you're actually meeting with alternative actors besides the junta. That was a very simple kind of step forward of showing that there is the sense of recognition of the different realities on the ground. Now, you've mentioned two other things that I think are very important. One is the South China Sea. And I do think there are many other commentators who have rightly raised the need for, hopefully, for a code of conduct. Not so easy to do because Malaysia is one of the players in the issues of the South China Sea. So it makes it more challenging for their chairmanship to embrace this. And of course, it also is challenging because Malaysia is also the representative with China in terms of speaking to China on issues within ASEAN. So therefore, it also puts Malaysia in a difficult position to be able to have this. But there are real big calls. And there's also been calls for changes on climate change. So the thing is, you prioritize, have plans. If you try to do too many things, then you have a problem of actually deliverables. And let's, as you rightly said, the dynamics now are much more challenging. This is arguably one of the most challenging times for any country to be leading ASEAN as a chair because of the divisions within it and because of the threats that are coming to the organization from outside and because of the global perspectives of change that are happening in terms of higher levels of uncertainty.
The Balik Pulau Member of Parliament, Yusmani Yusof, has written his own op-ed in response, I think partially in response to your op-ed, and he said that you might have misread the situation. But it seems to me that both of you seem to be coming from the same place, which is that the ASEAN issue is a collective issue to be addressed collectively, not as an individual, which seems to me that you're both from the same place, not from opposing sides of the equation. Does this reservation for Anwar come from the fact that domestically he has not addressed the domestic house before he takes on the regional house because his domestic house seems to be in some sort of disarray first? Is that where the misinterpretation comes from?
Yeah, he's the former member of parliament. But yes, I would say that, the opposition is currently in Balik Pulau. But the fact is that we have a situation where he has been Yusmani Yusof, who was, I think, I wrote a very good at that. And let me just say that I welcome the discussion and debate on these issues, especially those that focus on the issues rather than focus on trying to see these things as overly sensitive as a way of not constructively. I think the idea here is to focus on constructive discourse. I think the domestic factors clearly shape the responses. One is, I think, that there is a sense that there's oversensitivity, right? So it's been 10 years since Malaysia has been chair. And there's been a lot of changes in ASEAN from a perspective of the way they engage external perspectives and engage the media. And so in the Langkawi meeting, one of the challenges was how foreign media was being engaged with. And I think so there needs to be recognized that there has to be a changed way. This was clear in the previous chairmans in Laos and under Indonesia. We saw a lot more engagement. And I think that is an important lesson that I think I had also referred to. I would also say that the domestic considerations is a challenge. One of the features that we've seen under Anwar Ibrahim's prime ministership has been to rely heavily on external legitimacy to try to build legitimacy at home. And I think that he's not alone. There are other leaders who do that. But it becomes a challenge when you're dealing with an organization that is made up of 10 different countries and that there are limits and constraints to do that, especially when traditionally the person who is supposed to be seen to be leading the ASEAN chairmanship is a foreign minister, and Anwar Ibrahim is a finance minister rather than a foreign minister, although he is very prominent in setting the directions for nationally. So I think that the sense of wanting to build legitimacy at home through this particular engagement has shaped this. And there are critics that are saying he needs to get his house in order. So those are not the issues that I've raised. And if you look at my other columns, I talk about the need of reform and others. I do think I've talked about multiple issues in terms of the economy, and we've had these conversations before in our discussions. I do think that, but I do feel that if he continues to play such a prominent role, that you will have backlash because there are concerns about how things are being addressed within Malaysia. But the fact of the matter is that this ASEAN chairmanship and this role that is played internationally is extremely important now for those issues, such as the economy. And that's, for example, why I raised the issue about the need to have a common ASEAN strategy to deal with tariff structures that are and trade issues, because this is going to affect consumers domestically. So I wouldn't go so far as what you were saying and saying that he needs to get his house in order, because I think the government is working very hard in some of those things. Yes, there are challenges. There's no question about that. But I would say more that one has to recognize that clear plans and priorities help to be constructively manage a relationship where you have high profile, but people see the benefits of that profile and see concrete results from that.
Part of the brouhaha, Bridget, came from the fact that he's got this informal advisory council. I mean, Thaksin is one of them. And then there's a whole bunch of speculation as to the others, right? Including Georgio, Hun Sen, of course, Cambodia, even Hassan al-Bolkiah or Brunei, and a whole bunch of other luminaries, past and present. That seems to be part of the reason why there's a bit of brouhaha around this issue. Generally speaking, though, it seems to me that these individuals will be well placed to advise Anwar from a regional perspective. And certainly some of them have quite good ties with Myanmar, right? So what is your gut feel about where this is going?
So I think that when you bring in senior people, and I think with perhaps the exception of the Sultan of Brunei, in terms of what we're looking at is these politicians have considerable their own issues within the context of the countries that they were in. So keep in mind that Thaksin, for example, has serious challenges and issues of the Takpai massacre, when he was prime minister, which is now 20 years on from this October. In terms of southern Thailand, we see a situation where his party Putai entered into a coalition with conservative leaders and parties in the military in Thailand over the will of the people in the 2023 May election in Thailand. So there are different views about him, and that importantly, has been very active on issues of Myanmar, and the interest of Thailand and interest of Thaksin on Thailand have created some controversies. And I think those are not necessarily have been shared widely within the context of Malaysia, but those of us who follow Myanmar, the attempt to, for example, to try to convince the ethnic armed groups to have a ceasefire and others really backfired in terms of bringing players to the room. And now you have multiple stakeholders. And I think in this regard, the envoy, Malaysia's envoy there, they bring in unnecessary baggage into some of these conversations if you're seen as being tied to certain other areas and getting advice in a particular direction. This doesn't mean that a former Prime Minister Thaksin won't have something to offer. I think that there are some elements about value, but I think one has to be careful when you operate in a different way to recognize the constraints and the backlash that might come from that actually may make it a situation more difficult. So what I have suggested in another discussions is that perhaps a broader committee on Myanmar of experts, as opposed to one or two individuals, so that it is more inclusive, which is the idea of a more inclusive consultative discussions offer, I think, more promise than just bringing one or two and one individual on this particular issue.
Bridget, Just I guess, as we near the close of this conversation, where's the opportunities for Anwar to really, perhaps, if he can, align Malaysia's interests domestically with the region's interests? I mean, in both cases, he's reached some level of maturation with his prime ministership, and he's come to a point where he's really got to consolidate what he's done in the last couple of years. Is there a way to align and use 2025 as a way to just say, here I am, look, this is what I'm going to stand for, this is what I'm going to do. It's only February, we've got 10 more months to go. What do you think?
So let me just go back to the point that this is not an Anwar chairmanship. It is an ASEAN chairmanship. So the question is really leading all 10 countries as opposed to this. And that generally most leaders don't see the ASEAN chairmanship as an opportunity to align with their interest in their prime ministership. They see it as an opportunity to strengthen ASEAN. And I think that, we saw that, for example, very interestingly, when Jokowi, a very prominent former president of Indonesia, his approach was to allow the foreign minister to lead ASEAN in the chairmanship, and his role was very minimalist. And so it allowed the diplomats and the secretariat, because it's a different organization than it was 10 years ago. It's much more bureaucratized, and there were lots of different actors. So I think that type of question that you've asked about how to align with his prime ministership, really, I think is the wrong question to be asking. The question is, leadership strengthen ASEAN and particularly serve the region. And that's where the point where my article was marked at is, hey, look, the economy on common areas that need regional cooperation, issues of crisis. I talked promisingly about the idea of climate change. So I think this particular period of time would best be served by focusing on recognizing that ASEAN and Southeast Asia is now in a period of time of high levels of vulnerability, and the more that can strengthen the organization together. And in this regard, I think Anwar's strength has always been his ability to bring groups together, and he's a bridge. And I think, to answer the question more directly in a different way, is that I think that the bridging capacity of bringing different players to get together in dialogue is a very important step. But at the same time, managing expectations, I think, is an important dimension of that.
Yeah, Bridget, it's always good to be corrected with a more universal and consensual solution rather than individualistic, which is good. Thank you for that. In closing, obviously a year from today, if you were to be writing a column on this, which I'm sure you will be, given the fact that Anwar's a dialogical leader, he's a man of dialogues, isn't he, right? If all were to go well, where would you see ASEAN in 2026, February?
Well, I think the most important thing is that we're going to see one can always maintain hope and positivity. And I think, rather than use the dialogue back and forth as a negative force to bring positive. So I think I would expect ASEAN to be 11 members as opposed to 10, with the inclusion of Timor-Leste, which there's talk of that to happen in May. And that, I think, would be a very positive thing. But we'll see whether or not there's still resistance among some of the ASEAN players. But I think one of the things that Malaysia has done has been very, very strongly supportive of Timor-Leste as an additional country. Number two, I think that there will be a strengthening of issues of centrality from the perspective of trying to find common core ground. This is always difficult because it often could be the lowest common denominator. But I think that where will that come from and what areas? Hopefully that'll be in the area of a bit more steps on climate change. And this is, again, me looking at it from a positive lens. And the third is that there will be open discussion of multiple actors in the Myanmar crisis, and hopefully, a recognition that maybe different perspectives on the ASEAN crisis and different approaches can actually do more effective to solve the problem for Myanmar. Those are the things that I would hope that I see, and I see the organization continuing. And keep in mind, Malaysia is a core member of ASEAN, a founding member. So no matter where she's not chair or if she is chair, she will still play a very important role. And so the role won't end in a year. It will continue. And whoever's prime minister, and I expect that it will be Anwar Ibrahim next year, will continue to play an important role among the leaders within the region.
One last question, Bridget, if I can, before you go. Trump's bluster on tariffs, they seem to be, well, according to some quarters, to be more bark than bite in terms of getting people to the negotiating table. To what extent do you think that's true, given what you know about the Republicans and Donald Trump himself? And do you think these concerns are overblown from ASEAN's perspective?
Actually, this is the issue on this week's Straight Talk Southeast Asia, where I discussed this with an economist, Trin Zuin, who talks about the issues of the region. I have a different view than she has. I do think that these issues of economic coercion has two major consequences. One is that it basically erodes some of the cooperative order, and we've already seen tariffs. So this is going to mean that there's going to be increase in consumer prices in some sectors. And while I think the Southeast Asia countries hopefully will be able to navigate some of the tariffs compared to some of the other countries because they're less on the Trump administration's radar, the fact is that tariffs on China spill over here. So you're going to see changes in the supply chain, changes in reshoring, and some countries are going to do better than others than that. The real challenge will be whether or not Southeast Asian countries themselves become at risk. So I think that, given that the risks have already, we've seen a pattern of Trump putting those things out there. There are many forces within that administration, not just himself, who are acting for it. I think that even if it does end up being less of a bluster, then I think that there needs to be adequate preparation to be conscious of what the type of strategizing, what the type of approaches should be. And equally remember that these things are not just about the economy. It's about trying to coerce countries into different policy strategies, be it on immigration, be it on issues associated with fentanyl, which was mentioned by one of the members of Greer, who is a new member of the Trump administration. And those issues, there are other issues in Southeast Asia that they may try to pressure and use economic coercion as part of. And that, I think, involves a holistic look strategically to figure out how to respond. I remain of the view that the region, ASEAN as a whole, is stronger together. And I'm not a naysayer to ASEAN. I'm one that believes that ASEAN can make a difference, but it does so better on the same page.
Fantastic, Bridget. As always, thank you so much for your time.
Most welcome.